Yeah, welcome everyone to tonight's talk on Mid Wales moths, a beginner's guide to moth trapping and also recording. We're going to touch on recording wildlife and in particular moths. That's with Norman Lowe, who's the Vice County Recorder for Breconshire, BC42. And this event is one of a whole series we've been running in the last 8-9 months, and it's thanks to funding that we received from the Brecon Beacons National Park and CLIF Bar. So thanks to both of those for enabling us to put this series of events on. Oops, I was at the end of the talk, sorry about that. So this are we are the Biodiversity Information Service for Powys and Brecon Beacons National Park. You can see the area in red there that we cover. So we collect and collate wildlife records for that area and make them available for people to see and make use of. And that might be for population change information or for people doing university courses, so for research, or maybe for writing management plans if you work for Wildlife Trust involved in managing nature reserves. We're one of 4 local environmental record centres in Wales, and we all work collaboratively together to put wildlife on the map across Wales, and the other 3 are covering North Wales, West Wales and South Wales. You should be able to see those now. Yep, there we go. You can see we're in Mid Wales here. We're the only one of the 4 LERCs in Wales that don't have any coastline, so we do lack marine records, although we do get some, obviously salmon swimming inland. So that's who we are in the area we cover, and all 4 alerts, including this, are about putting wildlife on the map. So getting people such as yourselves to record the wildlife that you see, such as this garden tiger moth, really beautiful moth that may turn up in your moth trap or in your garden. And on the right, you can see the red dots, and they are records of garden tiger moths that we have in our database in the last 5 years, so since March 2016, so just over 5 years. So you can see there's quite a few there, and they've come in from people such as yourselves and Norman, and then we've mapped to them, and then we get an idea of where garden tiger moths live, so we can get an idea of population levels and also over time population change. It's really easy to make wildlife records. There's apps and online recording sites which make it really easy. So in Wales you can use the Lurk Wales app. You can get that on your smartphone and iPad on the Android Play Store and Apple App Store, iTunes Store, and that's one of the iRecord family of apps. So you can use iRecord, which is the one to use for the whole of the UK, or if you're in Wales you can use the Lurk Wales app. And there's also online recording if you prefer to do your wildlife record submissions online. You can use iRecord online, or in BIS we have our own called BIS Wired. So you can Google those and register for an account. When you are making a wildlife record, there's 4 important pieces of information that we definitely need, and that's the what, where, when and who. So we need to know what you've seen, what wildlife you've seen, where you saw it, so a location, name and a grid reference, and when you saw it, the date, and who recorded it, so that's you as the recorder. So the what, where, when and who are the 4 important pieces of information. And there's lots of help and advice available. If you go to our website, bis.org.uk, you can find lots of information on wildlife recording there, and also a YouTube link where I'll post this talk when I've downloaded it and edited it and then uploaded it onto YouTube. And you can also see all our other course events that we've run in the past year or so. You can see what events we're running. We are starting to do more outdoor events now, so in-person events. So have a look at our events page. And there's also a find an expert section where you can find the contact details of the people involved in the different areas of recording. So for moths, we have an expert in each of the 3 main vice counties in Mid Wales. So Peter Williams in Montgomeryshire, Pete and Ginny Clark in Radnorshire, and Norman, who we've got here tonight in Breconshire. And they're very willing to receive email inquiries, phone call inquiries about moths, and are able to give you any advice and help with that. So do have a look at the Find an Expert section. And also, if you're familiar with social media, we are on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. So look us up on there, and we post regularly on there so you can see what we're seeing and what records we're getting on social media. So lots of ways to get involved. And of course, one of them is this event tonight. So I'm going to stop my share and I'm going to welcome Norman Lowe, the Vice County Recorder for moths in Breconshire. I'm just going to mute everybody, Norman, so you just have to unmute yourself. I forgot that I didn't do it during my talk. So welcome to Norman, and when he's ready, do you want to start your screen share, Norman, and then we'll learn all about the moths and recording of and tracking of in Mid Wales.
Oh, there it is.
Yep.
Can everybody hear me? I hope you can.
Yep.
Right. Well, as you can see, I'm going to be talking about moth recording for beginners. That'll be all sorts of ways of finding moths and recording them, but also concentrating to an extent on wetlands, because National Moth Night comes this next weekend, and that focuses on wetlands, as you will hear. Why aren't I moving on?
If it won't do that, Norman, if you go to the top and do pause share and then restart it, that usually works.
Yeah, well done. Thank you. Phew. It's a good job somebody knows about these things, isn't it?
Yeah,
okay.
I learned that myself.
Right, I'm going to go through all of these things on the screen now. So we're going to talk a little bit about Moth Night, which is the coming weekend. I'm going to be talking a bit about how you find moths, how you identify and record them. And we'll have a look at some common moths you'd likely to see at this time of year. And then, of course, we've got to go to wetland moths, because that's the focus of what we're going to be doing at the weekend. And we might finish up with some local rarities just for fun. So let's take it from there, take it from the top. Moth Night 2021. It was founded in 1998 by Atropos. I don't know if anybody has come across Atropos. They're the publishers of this magazine. And it's expanded over the years and hoovered up other participants, other partners, including Butterfly Conservation, well, especially Butterfly Conservation and CEH, the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. So it's quite a big event now, and I think there are lots and lots of participants. So that's a good reason for having this talk today, just in advance of the weekend. So it's a celebration of moth recording throughout Britain and Ireland. All about moths, but each year, as you see there, a theme is chosen, and this year it's going to be wetlands. And we have some quite nice wetlands in our part of the world. I know that not all of you are from Mid Wales or from Breconshire, but I presume that you can probably find not too far away from where you are in the UK, some wetlands to have a look at. Let's hope so. Techniques. I've chosen that picture for techniques because it's got quite a few bits and pieces in it. There's some moths on it, which is nice. Some egg boxes. We'll come across egg boxes later on. There's a bit about looking carefully at your moth. If you're like me, you need glasses. There are my high-powered glasses. If you want to put them in a tube, there's a tube to put them in. There's little moths sitting in the tube. And recording, there we are. There's my pen, my book, and my numbers. Counting the moths as well. So it's, well, I wouldn't say it's all there, but there's quite a spread of techniques just on that slide. Moving on. Light trapping. I do like that picture. It's It's a picture that shows people being interested in one thing, or looking at the moth trap and seeing what they are. It's a friendly picture, I think. So you have lots of moths. So that means, of course, because it's easy to do, and because you get lots of moths in your moth trap, it means an awful lot of records for nighttime moths, which is fine. But so if you decide you want to have a trap of some kind, you want to trap moths and you haven't got something already, or you might want to change, I thought I'd just go quickly through the different kinds that there are. So you might want to trap in your garden, which is the easiest way, because you can usually have mains power. But there are people not too far away from here who don't have very good mains power and have to rely on their generators at home. But I hope that not too many of you are in that situation. And you can pick either an actinic tube or a mercury vapor tube, or sometimes even in LEDs. They're starting to come in as well. It's ultraviolet light, of course, that attracts moths especially. I don't really know why, but there we are. Or you might want to go into the wider countryside, in which case you will need a mobile trap. Well, there won't be mains electricity, so again, it's either batteries or a generator. Generators are a bit large and expensive and heavy, but some people do use generators quite a lot for mobile recording. I don't. I'm a battery man myself. And there's the Skinner trap. That's what I've been using for years and years and years. And you can see that it's made of plywood. The shell little lips here are to take perspex sheets, which the moths are attracted to the ultraviolet light, which is this here. They go down into a space at the bottom of the perspex sheets and land in the egg boxes and rest overnight, and are there for you happily in the morning, ready to be identified and let go. Now you can see the cables going to off the screen to my outside PowerPoint. I've had that trap for many years, probably about 15 years or so, but it's looking really sorry now because I left it in the garden throughout the whole year, 365 days, and after a bit it started to rot down and it's really looking very sad now. So I moved on to the plastic Skinner trap. These don't rot, of course, though I suspect that I don't know how long plastic lasts with the UV light might cause degradation. But it's smaller and lighter. It's easy to carry. You can carry it from where you are into my shed, which is great on rainy days, rainy mornings. It catches just as many moths, I find, as the big wooden Skinner trap, but it's more difficult to actually get your hand in and out of. It's more awkward to use, but it's very good for catching moths. Last Friday, I put my moth trap out in my garden and got 200 moths of 77 species, which was quite a challenge to identify the following morning. I was there for most of the day. Having said that, earlier on this year, with all the cold weather we've had, there have been very few moths indeed sometimes. Next kind of trap that is the Robinson trap, which is something like a round version of the Skinner trap, and usually has mercury vapor lights to power it. I bought one about 5 or 10 years ago and tried it out, and to my disappointment I didn't get good results from it. So it's interesting, many people get very good results from Robinson traps, so don't write them off, but I've personally found them not to be as good as Skinner. Then the third type, main type of trap. There are lots of others, of course. There are various variations of these and some weird and wonderful varieties as well. The third main trap is called the heath trap. This is especially useful for mobile trapping, taking it out into the countryside. It's small, it's light, a battery, yes, but if you can run to a lithium-ion battery, they're expensive but small and light and last a good long time. And that powers the ultraviolet tube there. And again, the moths drop through that hole into the body of the trap and into the egg boxes you have placed strategically there for the use of the moths overnight and waiting for next morning. So you can take them out all over the countryside, and we have moth evenings, don't we, Ben? We have moth evenings quite often in Breconshire with moth traps of this kind. We had one on Thursday night, Wednesday night, wasn't it? Wednesday night and Thursday morning. We've got about 80 species then. So there's a good lightweight trap for mobile use. You can use it in the garden, of course, but I think you probably find you get fewer moths than you would with a Skinner. Don't forget, if you've got any questions, put them on the chat line and we'll come to them at the end. The great thing about the heat trap is it's small enough to go into a plastic crate. So there you can see the trap, the funnel, the vanes because the moths fly around tend to fly around the light and hit the vane and drop down. The connections at each end, pretty waterproof. The whole thing is fairly waterproof. The magic electrics, that's the expensive part of any light trap. It usually is the electrical equipment. And there's the battery there. All going into a crate that's easy to pick up and carry and move around from place to place. Also fits nicely into the boot of the car. In fact, you can get several into the boot of your car if you've got a decent sized boot. Quite a few of our Brecon Moth members come along to evenings and bring 2 or 3 traps of this kind. And it just all adds to the fun. This, of course, is my garden. And you can see the variety of things I have in my hedge. There's ground elder and not much else, I'm afraid. Never mind. That's the point, though. One thing I don't think I've actually illustrated in this particular talk is where to put a moth trap. But I find that moths like shelter, so a hedge is good. They tend to fly along hedge lines, partly because of the shelter and partly because the food plants are there for the larvae for laying eggs, and partly because you also get, in verges, you get flowering plants for nectar. So I always think it's a better idea to put a moth trap in a sheltered location beside a hedge, perhaps in a wood, under a tree, rather than outside in a field. People think that maybe if you put it in a field, it casts its light a long way and moths come from far away. Well, they may do, but I've had less success in open fields than I do beside a hedge. The other problem is the sunshine in the morning. Unless you get there very early, if the sun's shining on your trap, it gets awfully warm and the moths get active. Some of them fly out before you get to them, and some of them fly out immediately you lift up the top of the trap to have a look inside. So beware of sunshine. There's my very first actinic light. I must have had that certainly over 40 years and getting on 50 years, I think. And all it is a little 6-watt bulb. There's a little 6-watt bulb with the electrics and going off to a battery. And the way I've used that for many years is to put it onto a white sheet. And the moths land on the white sheet and you can have a look at them and tube them or let them go. And they usually fly away again anyway. Very good for social events because you can put the white sheet on a table or something and they're at sort of chest level and you can see them much more easily. And you can gather around the table and see what's coming in. So actinic light and sheet is quite a useful way. And you can even, I mean, my very first moth trap back in the 1970s was one of the, in fact, it was this here, stuck inside a plastic bucket. And the vanes were made of a sugar puff packet, which I cut up and stuck together. So you don't have to spend huge amounts of money if you're willing to do a bit of DIY. Most people probably wouldn't want to use a sugar puffs packet, but there we are. I did so to start me off, and I got some nice records. And that's what you see in the moth trap. There's the egg box. You can see it's got rough edges, and the moths like rough edges. They don't like to land on something too smooth. So it's a good idea if you've got a plastic moth trap with a smooth walls inside to take a piece of sandpaper and scrub it a bit to roughen it, to enable the moths to be able to get their legs attached and be able to sit there comfortably. So that's one reason why egg boxes are so useful. The other is, of course, they've got their little areas like this where moths can hide. But sometimes they just sit on the edge of the trap. And sometimes you get a significant surprise when something as massive as this sits in your trap. It's the only time I've ever had convolved with a swamp moth. And it does, I mean, there's a normal sized moth, the flame carpet. And this massive great thing was there. So I was really quite amazed to see that, and very pleasant surprise it was. But that's what you're going to see in the moth trap. And you remember the very first slide I showed you, the one with all those moths on it. Sometimes you can have huge numbers, and sometimes it can be quite a challenge to look at and to identify all the species that are there. There are other techniques for nighttime. Nectar. Plants that are nectar sources are very useful for attracting butterflies, of course, and other insects, but also at nighttime attracting moths. One thing you might find if you've got a buddleia bush in your garden, go out when it's dark with a torch, and you'll see lots of little winking lights shining back at you. That's the eyes of moths as they crawl around on your buddleia flower, taking nectar and feeding. And that's quite another cheap way of going to look for moths at night time. Just look at your nectar sources with a torch. And even sometimes shining the torch around grass stems, you can see you can see the eyes of the moths, the light reflecting off the compound eyes of these moths. Or you could use something called sugar. Now this is, I think, probably popularized in the last century, the century before, when moth traps weren't available. How do you encourage nighttime moths to come and visit your patch? And what you're doing is mimicking, if you like, the nectar in flowers by making something sweet for the moths to be attracted to. And the recipes for this stuff are many and various, and sometimes you think there's almost a bit of witchcraft involved, because there's black treacle, black sugar, old beer, all sorts of tinctures of this and that to add to make it attractive to moths. I must say I've never had much success. Sometimes you do get a bit of success, but I've never had very many. And now that moth traps are so easily available, I think that sugar is falling very much into disrepair, disuse. Another something that's similar to sugar but not quite the same is wine ropes, and this involves getting strips of cloth and getting a washing line or something like that across your garden or across a space in your garden, and hanging your strips of, well, before you hang them up, you dip your pieces of cloth into red wine, soak them in red wine, hang them up like a washing line, and await events. Again, you won't get too many species, but there's one species that is notorious for coming to wine ropes, and that is the old lady moth. And if you want to see old ladies, then wine ropes are your best bet. They don't come to light very much. I don't think they come to sugar very much. You don't see them an awful lot, but they do come to wine ropes. There's some joke there somewhere. I can't think what it might be. So that's moths at night time. And as I've said, that is they're the kinds of moths that people particularly record, because it's so easy to get large numbers of moths in your moth trap every day, if you like, and record them. But there are moths in the daytime, and lots of them as well. We'll come on to books later on, but you get a really good book about Britain's day-flying moths, which tells you all about them. So it's worth trying to find some daytime moths if you can, because they are under-recorded. And there's only one real main rule for finding daytime moths, and that's going out and looking and searching, observation. But you can have some help. Nectar is one, and pheromones are another. I'm always, well, the third thing about moths in the daytime is they want to avoid being eaten by birds and other predators. So one, avoid being eaten. Two, food. And three, pheromones. It reminds me of the story about what people tell me about dogs. I don't have a dog, so I'm not a great expert, but apparently there are only 4 things that dogs like, and that is one for each leg: food, sex, and food, I'm told. And that applies to an extent to moths, because they have to have food and they want to find a mate as well. So we make use of all this. But if you want to live, you've got to avoid being eaten, and so you need to be camouflaged. And there's the cloaked carpet moth. Now, really, it is very difficult to see that from a distance. You would walk past that very easily and not notice it. It's only because I let the thing go and put it on my garden seat, I was able to see it and come up and photograph it. But that is, I think, particularly good camouflage. You'll notice that the wings of the moth are very closely, held very close against the background. And that's to avoid shadows. They try to remain flat so they don't cast shadows that give them away. So you'll see a lot of moths are very tightly attached to what they landed on. Hiding in plain sight. Everybody can see that, but subterfuge is what this one uses. I'm a bird dropping, it's saying. And of course, superficially, that's what it looks like. And presumably, it's very successful at doing that because it survived. That is the clouded magpie moth. And you find it in elm woods. The caterpillar feeds on elm. That's one of the best bird dropping moths, but there are a whole lot of micro moths that have got a special book for themselves, if I can find it. There we are. Bird dropping tortrix moths of the British Isles. So there's a whole host of different kinds of moths that have found that it's very useful to be able to look like a bird dropping and manage to avoid being eaten. So subterfuge is one of the other ways of avoiding being eaten, being a food for a predator. But again, most moths, not all moths, feed during their lifetime. Most moths do. And one of the favorite foods for moths is nectar, and thistles are very good. And so in the daytime, one of the moths that is very obvious in the daytime are the burnet moths. I guess most of you would have seen burnet moths and are aware of this, but it's a very easy way of telling burnet moths. The 6-spot burnet has, there's my arrow gone, there it is, my cursor. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 spots. And then there's a 5-spot burnet that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spots. Oh no, 5 spots. Oh, it's missing that one. It's got 5 spots. But a sad story. I have 1 or 2 sad stories in this account, I'm afraid. The sad story about that is that there are 2 species of 5-spot burnet. So it's not as easy as you might think. There's a 5-spot burnet and the narrow-bordered 5-spot burnet. And they're awfully difficult to tell apart. Theoretically, you'd think from the name that one had a narrow border than the other, but I'm not convinced that's necessarily always the case. Thankfully, they have different life histories. One of them feeds on vertebrate trefoil, and the other one feeds on a range of plants such as clovers. So you've got an idea by looking at the habitat what the species is. Certainly in my county, in Breconshire, we think that the narrow-bordered 5-spot burnet is only found in the extreme southeast of the county, and everywhere else it's the 5-spot burnet. But I remain to be proved wrong, and I'm quite sure somebody will find the wrong one in the wrong place for me and say, Norman, you're wrong again. That's the 6-spot burnet, and there are quite a lot of other moths that feed on nectar of that kind, a day flying. My voice is going. Hope it'll last another half hour or so. We'll see. And then we come to pheromones. For many years, people said Norman's pheromones don't work. It's very sad, because I would buy these pheromones. The pheromone, well, this is the pheromone lure. They were developed originally as a means of pest control, and it was sold to agriculture and industry to hang up to attract pests away from crops. But more recently, they've realized that they're also useful for people who are interested in beneficial insects, such as moths, such as non-pest species, and especially the clearing moths, which are day-flying moths and are incredibly difficult to find. The larvae feed inside inside trees or inside stems, difficult to find that way. The moths themselves are day flyers, but very rarely seen, even though they're thereabouts, because they're mimicking other insects and look different to moths. But when the pheromones came along, suddenly there was a way of attracting them. I tried so hard with my first lot of pheromones to find some in Breconshire without any success at all. And then they sent me to England and said, there's a spot here, Norman, where you can definitely find white-barred clearwing. So where I went, and lo and behold, to my amazement, I found them. So what you do is you put your lure, your pheromone lure, which is this, it's got the lure absorbed onto the plastic. So it's not something you tip out or anything else. You don't pierce them. You just put that in your bit of a net, hang it up on a tree, and this is the tip lure. There are about half a dozen, about 8 or 9 lures. This one attracts a number of species, 3 species, including the white-barred clearwing. And lo and behold, in England, they came to this lure. And I thought, with my old little camera, can I possibly get a photograph of this moth? Because it was the old kind where you press the button and the thing went click. By the time it clicked, things had flown away. But to my amazement, I got that photograph of the white-barred clearwing. But for many years, I had no success at all. And I tried one more time this year. I thought, this time, Norman, we'll give it a really good go and see what we can find. So I also bought a trap. This is another moth trap. This is the clearwing moth trap. There it is. Not all that large, but see how that size. And you put your lure in there, and the idea is that the moth comes to the lure, flies inside, drops down inside, and sits there waiting for you in the base. So I thought I'd give it a go. I tried in my garden without any success. And then I was coming back from Abergavenny and found a nice little lay-by and thought, I'll have a try here. I'll hang up my my little box of tricks here and see what happens with the VES website, the VES lure rather. And that was supposed to attract something called the yellow-legged clearwing. And as you can probably see, it did. I hung it up, I parked in the lay-by, there's my car parked in the lay-by. I hung it up there. I had about half an hour to spare. And I put it there, and after 20 minutes, there was nothing at all. I sat in the car and got bored and started listening to the radio. I thought, right, I better go now, pick up my wife. Went back there, and goodness me, there was a clearwing sat in the trap. So I took it home and managed to get a photograph of it, which is, you must admit, a smart moth. It's called yellow-legged clearwings because it's got yellow legs and feeds on oak. So, success for once. I got another yellow-legged clearwing later on in my garden, would you believe? So that's two out of 2 moths. I think I've probably put the trap out about 30 or 40 times, so your success rate is not very high. But if you want to see clearwings, it does work. Any questions coming in, Ben? Or is everything clear so far?
Hi, Norman. Yeah, we've got a couple of questions. One relating to moth trapping from Jane, and you kind of answered it mostly immediately after the question had been posted, which was very good timing. But Jane was asking, can you use a sheet and bucket to make a moth trap, which we found out that you can with your sugar puff cut-out cardboard fins. But she also asked, can you use a torch? So can you just shine a regular torch, and would that attract moths? Or because you showed the actinic light, so does it need a special kind of light?
Well, yes, you can certainly use a torch, but you've got to use a torch for the moths that are there already. So using a torch on your budlier or your other nectar sources in the garden works very well, certainly. Torch very useful. It's also useful if you're gathered around a moth trap at night to see things flying away into the undergrowth. You can use a torch to track them. But a torch on budlier is can be very successful. And you don't have to use a moth trap at all.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, if you're on a holiday and don't have not to take your moth trap with you, I mean, you can do, but if you haven't, then again, a torch can be used for looking at things. Or you can just go for a walk with your torch, and actually the moths do fly into the beam of the torch. And I remember doing that quite successfully when I used to live in Yorkshire. So yes, torch can be a very useful piece of equipment.
Okay, that's good. We do have a very short video on our YouTube channel which we put out for Wales Nature Week, which was a few weeks ago now, and that was somebody just showing you how you can hang a sheet, say, on your washing line and shine a torch on it at night, and you will get some moths being attracted to that. So that's another kind of cheap and easy way to attract moths into your garden. And Jane says that she has buddleia, so I imagine that Jane might be outside after this talk when it's dark, shining a torch on a buddleia, if it's in flower yet. If it's a bit early for buddleia flowers, maybe.
It is, yes. But there are other nectar sources in the garden that are worthwhile. So try all of them if you want.
Yeah. So yeah, have a look at the video. It's very easy and obvious how to do it, but yeah, it's quite nice to see it being done. It's only a couple of minutes long. And then we also had a question from Bupinda about making records using the apps like iRecord and Lurk Wales, which is an iRecord app, and what happens to those records. And yes, any records that you make on iRecord or Lurk Wales or online using iRecord and BizWired will come to us as the local environmental record centre, or if they're made in a different part of the country, to the local environmental record centre in that area, and then they can then be put onto our database or whichever local environmental record centre's database, and then organisations like the wildlife trusts can make use of that data or request access to that data or those wildlife records and enable them to make use of it.
They need to be verified, don't they? They need to be verified, Ben, by that person, the county recorder, who verifies all of the records coming in. So on a fairly typical day, if I haven't been logging to iRecord terribly recently, I could have 300 individual records to verify. So I've got to look at the species, look at the record, decide if I'm confident that's the right species. Very often there are photographs to look at, and on the basis of all that information, I say yes, no, or maybe. Usually yes, but not always.
So yeah, any moth records that you put into the app or online that are in Breconshire, Norman will see those, and that's why it's really useful to add a photo. And we can see the photo of the yellow-legged clearwing there. If you submit a record with a photo, it does make it really easy for Norman and the other experts, the other verifiers, to verify that is the moth or whichever wildlife that you've seen. So Norman just does moths, so any moth records you make in Breconshire will be seen by Norman. And actually having a verified record makes that record much more valuable, because we know that yes, you definitely have seen that particular moth in that particular place. So it just gives that record added value. So any information that you can add to the record on top of the 4 things that I mentioned, such as a photo or even a comment about what it looked like or what it was doing or where you found it, that's always really useful. So, and
it's true to say as well that unless it's been verified by the county recorder, it won't be accepted by Butterfly Conservation for their moth database. So they have to be verified for inclusion in the various atlases that are produced.
Yeah, I suppose for certain publications, certain research projects, then they want to know that record is kind of genuine, or it is the thing that you've said it is, that you have definitely seen it, just because that added value is really useful, enables the records. So yeah, Norman's showing the atlas now, which only has verified records in there. So the more information you can give when you put your record in to the apps and online, the more likely it is to be verified and given added value. So and quickly, Jane also asks about how often you should record. Yes, this is a good question. You can record as often as you like. So as Jane says, if you see the same moth or the same bird every day, you can make a record every day. You don't have to. I mean, it's totally up to you. I'd say maybe for moths, if you're like Norman and you have your trap out in your garden every Friday, then you'd be making moth records maybe of the same species every week. So the same with birds, maybe you make that record every week or every month. I guess the difference between birds and moths is that moths, certain species will be around, say, for April and May, and then the adults will die off, and then you'll start getting different moths being seen throughout the year. So I think record as often as you want to or feel that you should. So there's no set rule as to how often you should record things.
But also, I would say, don't, and I'll come on to this later on in the talk, don't forget the common moths. Because certainly some other recorders I talk to, but in other groups, they say that the ones that are not recorded at all, that are under-recorded, are all the common ones. People go and record the rare ones, but forget to record the common ones. So a mammal recorder will have almost no record of rabbits, for example, because nobody bothers recording them. So it's not easy, but recording more is better than recording less.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And that goes for all species. The common ones are under-recorded because they're so common, people don't think, oh, I'll record that. Whereas if you see a rare moth or a rare bird, then you are more likely to want to share that information because it's a little bit more exciting, I suppose. So yeah, do record everything, including the common and also the rare.
Any more questions, Ben?
No, that's it for now. If you're happy to carry on?
Oh, absolutely. I thought it was a good idea to just check that people are following with me and are not being left behind or needing further information.
Yeah, I've made a few notes. I like the idea that egg boxes are used in moth traps. You know, kind of a waste product from our diet. There isn't anything like high tech being developed because I guess egg boxes just work so well that you don't need a specialist moth trapping substrate in your trap.
Well, I know that everybody has their own method of doing all sorts of things in terms of moths. I don't know anybody who doesn't use egg boxes in moth traps, which is quite amazing, I suppose. Okay, let's move on then. Let's see what comes next, shall we? You can always look out for caterpillars. And if you want, you can read them through as well. Many of you may recognize this species. This is the mullein moth. So what you do is you get the mullein, either a wild mullein or one from a garden centre, and you plant it, and you find it absolutely ravaged by the mullein moth. Unless you want the thing to come, in which case they won't. I planted a mullein plant in my garden, had it for several years, and at long last I got the mullein caterpillar in my garden, and it was feeding on buddleia. You can't win. But this year was good. I had a mullein plant, and it's been ravaged by caterpillars, and I don't mind that at all. And I bred several out. They got a nice big size, like the one you can see there, and then they dig their hole in the ground, and they pupate over the winter and come out next spring. And if another sad story in a sense, it's slightly sad. If you like mullein moths and you want to keep them in your garden, what better to do than to have your mullein plant and to breed the moth out and let it go. And this is what some recorders that I was speaking to did this year, in fact. I was speaking to them last week. And they had bred these mullein moths out, and they let them go in their garden beside the mullein plant. What happened? Not a sniff, nothing at all. They let these moths go last year, this year or this spring, and they obviously flew away somewhere else to lay their eggs because they wouldn't be seen dead in the same garden as they came from, which seemed very strange to me. But that's just life. That's wildlife recording, wildlife observation. Things don't work the way you expect. So the mullein moth caterpillar feeds on mullein, yes, but also on buddleia and on figwort as well. But certainly garden centres aren't very keen on this caterpillar because you end up with a skeleton of leaves and big droppings and one or two very large caterpillars. The reason they look like that, there's no camouflage there whatsoever. They sun themselves deliberately because they ingest the toxins from the plant, the leaves, and store it inside their bodies, and therefore taste nasty and are poisonous as well. So a bird has one and never for the rest of its life has another one. So they're very safe and they have warning coloration. Identifying moths. There we are. There's my bookshelf. Books. There's the atlas I showed you. Atlas. There's a book by Skinner with the old-fashioned way of doing it with set specimens, so you can see the hindwings as well. There's a new edition of Manley, which has just come out, which I've got somewhere. I find that one is very useful, and also this one, Waring and Townsend. Well, there are two ways of depicting pictures of moths in books. One is with photographs, and one is with drawings. And Manley and Skinner use photographs, but Waring and Townsend use drawings. And the pictures the way that the moths actually land, the way you see them. I think it's probably nice if you can afford to have one of each, because in one way, with the drawings, you can pick out the distinguishing features of the moth. When you've got one with photographs, that's what the moth looks like in real life. And it's a good, it's quite useful when you're trying to identify a moth to have both varieties of illustration. But as you can see, my moth books are quite many and varied. The big white ones are the Moths and Butterflies of Great Britain and Ireland. That started coming out in 1976, I think it was. In 11 volumes, they said, 1 volume a year. Volume 11 was larvae, volume 1 to 10 the different families of moths. Well, you can imagine what happened. Volume 1 came out in 1976. We are in 2021, and volumes 6 and 8 are still not available. It's a massive work, and probably beyond the scope of most people, but I refer to that all the time when I'm looking for something a bit obscure, particularly the micro moths. There's books on plume moths, as you can see there, pyralid moths, caterpillars, pug moths, day-flying moths. But just something different. Most moths books you buy as useful items, and useful, and they are useful. Some are more useful than others, but just sometimes you can indulge yourself and buy something that's just nice. And buy something with hand-colored illustrations, going back to the middle of the 19th century, by a guy called Stainton. And he produced all these illustrations of little micro moths. And what's it called? The Natural History of the Tynina, that's the smaller moths. And one of the other interesting things about this particular book, it's in a number of languages. It's in English, in French, in German, and in Latin. Amazingly, they don't seem to publish books like this anymore. But that, to me, is an indulgence and something I'm a great deal of amusement from. So that's books. And in the olden days, that's all you had, books. And in fact, when I first started looking at micro moths in particular, there were no books with illustrations, or almost no books with illustrations. My main one was something called Merrick, which only had descriptions, no illustrations at all. You don't know you're born, you lot, with these wonderful books that come out now with these fantastic illustrations. And now you've got online help as well. For example, in particular, the basic online resource to go to is UK Moths, ukmoths.org.uk, and that's extremely useful. And also, as Ben has mentioned, you've always got this, I hope at least, you've always got the option of finding someone who's more experienced than you might be and asking them. Certainly, if you're lucky enough to live in Breconshire, BC 42, then you can email me at any time with a picture of a moth or many moths. I had an email yesterday with 18 pictures of moths on it. Fine, I can identify them and they go into records. So if you can find somebody to help you, a mentor of some kind, then that'll help you too. Recording moths. There's my notebook, which I scroll the moth names down and the numbers. And wouldn't it be nice if that moth, for the sake of the illustration, was in fact a buff ermine or a broom moth or ribboned wave or a small square spotted spectacle? But it's not. It's a shuttle-shaped dart. So I'm afraid it's not sitting on its name. But there we are. So again, Ben touched on this in the introduction, but why do you record in the first place? We do need to know what is present in our area, or in the whole of the UK, or in the world. We need to know what's there. We need to, because we need to know which ones are threatened, for example, and we can perhaps do something about it. We need to know what their habitat needs are. We need to understand why a moth is localized. And then when you've done that, and only really when you've done that, can you manage for conservation. So recording is important. One of my favorite moths in terms of pictures, that's the figure of 8 moth. That's probably got two figures of 8 on it really, but there's the 8 there. That's a moth that's declining across the whole of the UK. And again, as Ben said, vital information, the identification, get that right, either yourself or with the help of somebody else. The date, the place, the grid reference, and the name of the recorder and the verifier is different. Those we do need. If you don't do that, or if you don't get it slightly wrong, you might have the specimen. But if you don't get all of those right, then in 100 years' time, when somebody wants to know where that species is now, they won't be able to understand the record that you made today. What's useful is the number seen, site information and weather conditions as well. But that's not quite so vital, but the identification, date, place and name are absolutely vital. Do you like this one, by the way? This one's called the blood vein moth, and you can see why. And then storing records. Well, you start off with a hard copy. You don't have to, of course, but I like hard copy. When somebody comes back to me and says, Norman, your record of such and such a thing in 1996, we don't think it's right. I can go back to my notebook, my scrawls notebook, and go back to that date in 1996 and see what I wrote down. And sometimes when people do that, I find that I've mistranscribed, and it was absolutely wrong. That what I wrote down in my notebook was right. What somehow got transposed into the record has gone wrong. And I think it's useful to have primary evidence to go back to. Then there's computer software such as Excel. I use Excel all the time. I've got all of my records in Excel because you can sort by, you can manipulate your records, and you can correct them as well easily on Excel. There's MapMate, which is very good for entering records. County Recorder, that's me in BT42, and there's Biz, which Ben has mentioned already. These records need to be stored safely for a long period of time, because things do change enormously. Species get commoner or less common, or become extinct, or possibly extinct. And if you think they're nearly extinct and want to go back and find it, you need to know where they were perhaps 50 or 100 years ago. Right, that's the hard work done. We've got half an hour. Thought we might just go through some moths, just to, they look nice, don't they? Let's see what we can find. Common moths. We all recognize this one, of course. The large yellow undoing, probably the commonest moth of all, just starting to come into season now. But common moths are important in themselves. Some are flagship species, I find. Some common moths are the ones that introduce people to moths for the first time. They see this fantastic moth and say, oh, look at that, and they're hooked. So flagship species are really important. Some species are under-recorded, I mentioned before. Daytime ones especially are under-recorded, and we don't know where they are, and we do need to. Some are supposed to be common in the books, but aren't. They've got rarer, and we need to know why. We need to record them as well. And some might be common in your part of the world, but aren't anywhere else. So don't forget the common species. Flagship species. I guess we all know that's one, the elephant hawk moth. That's something that lights up your moth trap when you come along in the morning and see some of those. I think I had 8 on last Friday. Buzzing round as well, trying to fly around in my moth trap, which wasn't terribly helpful. Not only is the moth a flagship species and gets people interested, but the caterpillar is as well, because it looks a bit like a snake. It's got eyes, and it's trying to look fearsome to be avoid being eaten. So people see this fearsome looking thing in their garden and ring me up and say, I've got this fantastic caterpillar on my garden. And 3 times out of 4 it's elephant hawk, but it brings people in. So that's one flagship species. The second close related one is the puffer hawk. People can't imagine how that has evolved to be like that, because it's such a strange looking moth. But of course what it's doing is looking like dead leaves. And you also might wonder why with moths with wings of that shape it manages to fly at all, but I assure you it does flies very well. Hawk moths do fly well. It's can be quite amusing when you're letting your moths go in the morning, your hawk moths, and they fly up and off. And the robins and the sparrows are there, of course, hoping to be able to have a little feast on your moths. I'm usually fairly careful about this, but when they fly away, you can't do much about it. When a hawk moth flies away, it's fine, because it can out-accelerate any kind of bird. And you watch the hawk moth whizzing off and the bird trying to catch up and getting left behind. And you think, good one, well done, that moth. So hawk moths are good fun to let go. The mother Shipton moth, a day flyer, under-recorded. And when I first started recording the moths, I couldn't understand why there were so many records of other things and hardly any at all of mother Shipton, even though I knew they were around. And do you know why it's called the mother Shipton? Because of the face of the old woman that you can see there. The mother Shipton moth, found usually in heathland and wetland areas, day flying, often found by people looking for butterflies. And sometimes they don't record them, even though they see them. Getting rarer, the common wainscot. I had a discussion with the county recorder from the Morgan 2 or 3 years ago about the common wainscot, and he said he thought it was extinct in his county altogether. He was getting almost no record, none at all, of common wainscot. And we don't know why. It's feet on grasses, but it's coming back again now, thankfully. But it's rarer than you would think with a name like common wainscot. I read the books and they say it's common as well. But for some reason, it's had a bad time recently. You'll recognise that picture again. That was used by Ben at the beginning, the garden tiger. When I was a young lad in the dim and distant past, we used to walk to school. And there was a patch of vegetation of some kind on the way. And there were always lots of garden tigers there. So many that we used to stop and have races between my garden tiger caterpillar and your garden tiger caterpillar. Not anymore, you don't see the moth at all, neither as commonly, and certainly not the caterpillar as common as you used to, but it's a lovely furry caterpillar. So they're the ones that are rarer than they used to be. Not common everywhere. The cloaked carpet is as common as anything in our part of the world, in mid Wales. The caterpillar feeds on stitchwort, and it's quite common. Read the books and they say a localized moth only found in a few places, but it's common here, but not everywhere. So again, just because it's common in your little patch doesn't mean to say it's common everywhere. The cloaked carpet. You can see why it's called a cloaked carpet. He's wearing a cloak. So that was common moths, wetland moths. That's our focus for this National Moth Night weekend. And you wonder why moths would be associated with a particular habitat. And the main reason, not the only one by any means, is the food plant. So, the obscure wainscot, poor thing being called that. It's not the brightest and best of the wainscots, it has to be said, but it feeds on Phragmites, the common reed. So you're only going to find that where you find common reed, so in really quite wetland areas. And it's one that's actually expanding in mid Wales. I had a communication from Pete and Jenny Clark just a couple of days ago saying that they got it new to the county. So we think that one's doing quite well. The obscure wainscot. The silky wainscot feeds in stems like Phragmites, but it doesn't feed on the plant itself. It's got a rather less savoury reputation in that. It feeds on other things it finds, other insects you find inside the Phragmites stem. But that is something that, that is found in wetland areas. Very variable. And sometimes quite difficult to identify because the markings change so much from one individual to another. Some moths are like that, and we don't necessarily know why. Some moths all look the same. Some moths vary enormously. There are one or two of the micro moths in particular that vary hugely from one individual to another. And the suggestion is that when they're sitting, many of them hibernate. When they're sitting hibernating on a tree trunk, the robins get used to one shape of a moth and go after them. And if you've got lots of different shapes, a different shaped decoration on your wing, then the moth doesn't get to recognize them all, and so some of them survive. So I think that's the reason they think that some moths are so variable. The crescent moth, it's got a crescent mark, and it feeds on yellow flag, which is mainly a wetland plant. The southern wainscot, another one that feeds on common reed, Phragmites. But wait a minute, you say. I'm sure you're saying this to yourself. You must be saying this. Doesn't that look awfully like the common wainscot? How do you tell the common wainscot from the southern wainscot? Some of you may know this already, but it's all about the Alice band. There's the Alice band from 1923. That moth was caught in Somerset in 1923. Was set by the guy who caught it and put into a collection, which ended up in a box on the street corner in an antique shop in Brecon about 10 years ago. And I got a phone call saying, "Norman, did you know there's some old moths for sale?" So I rushed off as soon as I possibly could and bought them all. And to think that moth is nearly 100 years old and it survived all of that hard life. Well, it hasn't survived, but the body has survived, if you like. Just for your education, there's the Alice band on the forehead of the southern wainscot. And the common wainscot doesn't have an Alice band. And that one's even older. That one's from 1913, from the same collection from Somerset. But you see, they put a data label on. So you have the identification, you have the place, you have the name of the person who caught it, and you have the date. So that is a valuable record going back 100 and so years. The oldest moth, I believe, in that collection was 1893. And if Norman's talking about moths, he's always going to talk a little bit about micro moths because they're so neglected and there's so much fun to be had from them. The micro moths are small. Well, they're not all small. Some of them are bigger than the macro moths, so that's not an excuse. People say they've got no English names, but they've all now been given English names as well. They say they're boring. No, they're not. And they're too hard to identify. Well, some of the butterflies are quite difficult to identify as well. Small skipper and Essex skipper can be quite hard. So I don't think that any of that's an excuse. Micro moths are good too. Look at that, the brown China mark, a wetland one, feeds on pondweeds, has an English name, and it's quite big. It's a damn sight bigger than many of the smaller moths, certainly the pugs. Just one that people do see, and it's a daytime flyer as well. So you can see that in wetlands quite easily. Flying now. What about that for a stormer? Dusky plume. None of the macros look like that, do they? That's something really different. That feeds on fleabane, a wetland plant. And the hoary plume feeds on marsh ragwort. If you see these things flying, they bounce around like this. They're lovely to watch flying. Now just bear with me. This has got nothing to do with wetlands. It's just fun. Look at that. That's a female red clover case bearer laying eggs. And look at the sheen on the wing. Look at the eye looking at you there. Look at its antennae with nicely furry antennae, different coloured legs, and lovely sheen, and laying eggs inside the flower of the red clover. And the eggs hatch and they bore into the seed head and eat the seeds. Then they make themselves a case, like a caddisfly case. And they exist in that case and hibernate over the winter and come out next year. So they're really, I just like that one. That's got nothing to do with wetlands, but I just like that particular moth. So I shared it with you. I'm finishing off completely with Breconshire rarities. The Silurian is one of the few moths that's really rare that we get in Breconshire. It's only to be found in Breconshire, Monmouthshire, and just into Herefordshire as well. That's the very first one we found in Breconshire. I've been looking for it for years and years and years. We finally found the caterpillar in Breconshire in 2013. It feeds at night, so you've got to go up under the top. It lives at 1,500 feet and above for a start. So you've got to go to the top of the hill, feeds at night in April. Now, I don't know where you live, but I can tell you that in Breconshire, 11 o'clock at night, at 1,600 feet, it's cold. And there you are on your hands and knees looking for this little caterpillar. But we found one, so it's in the county. There's the moth itself. And that's people in the middle of the night, having done some moth recording at the top of Heathrow Ridge, photographing their Silurians. Some keen people about, aren't there? Now, one of my all-time favourite moths, the Welsh clearwing, discovered originally in Wales and then lost from Wales and found in Scotland. And for a long time, it was thought only to exist in Scotland. And they found it in England as well. And now we're finding it in the mid Wales counties as well, in Radnorshire and Breconshire. It feeds on birch. But as I said, the clearing moths, they bore into the fruit plant, and this lives on the bark of birch inside the bark. So to have a sufficient thickness of a birch for it to do that, it needs a very old tree. That is a huge tree for a birch. Birch is not a long-lived tree, but that's absolutely enormous, and that one peppered with Welsh clearwing holes. There we are. There's such a hole. Look for that 5 millimeters across, round, in a big birch tree. You've got a good chance of it being Welsh clearwing. An even better chance if you see that sticking out, a pupal case. And if you take it out, you can actually identify the moth from it. You can make it a record to be certain that that is Welsh clearwing. And right, that's second lot of questions.
Thanks, Norman. One from Jane about the birch and the clearwing, the Welsh clearwing. Does it need to be any particular species of birch? Silver birch, downy birch?
That's a very good question, and I have heard, but I wouldn't put too much emphasis on this, that it prefers downy birch. It certainly seems like upland birches, but I don't think it's entirely clear cut. The thing to do is look. It also likes birch trees that have got some sun on them, because I think they like to be warmed up in the sunshine to dry their wings. So they seem to like ones that don't have too many low branches. They apparently associate especially with sheep grazing, because the sheep graze the lower branches of the birch and clear them off for the trunks to remain open and open to the sun. So you can add to our knowledge of this by looking for yourself and finding them or not finding them on whichever species of birch it is in whatever habitat it is. They're there to be found.
So more research needed on the particular species of birch being favoured, and if there is if it is actually a favoured, or will either one do? Okay.
Because birch trees are not just downy birch and silver birch. There are subspecies and all sorts of complications. So whatever, as much information as possible.
And of course, you do get downy and silver crossing, so it can be quite hard sometimes to determine which birch species you have.
Exactly. That's why it's dangerous to say, oh, this is silver birch, so it can't be on this. I won't look, because you just don't know. If you don't look, you don't find.
Yeah. And Jane says she might have seen a clearwing in the habitat you described. So yeah, if you do see something akin to the pictures that Norman's shown, then do try and get a photo and yeah, send it to us, send it to me or Norman, and then we can maybe take a look and hopefully verify another record of clearwing in
Brilliant. I mean, photographing
Wales.
clearings is really hard because they are, the word that the textbooks use for describing clearings is skittish. And that's describing to a T. They do. They are very difficult to do anything with. They bounce around all over the place. They fly very rapidly. They are skittish.
Yeah.
I thought it'd be a good idea to photograph the yellow-leg clearing I got in my garden by putting it in the fridge and taking it outside and putting it onto a piece of wood that would make it look natural. So it was a cold evening. They shouldn't be flying at this time in the evening anyway. They're day flyers. It'll be cold. They won't go anywhere. They'll just sit there. Nope. It bounced around, disappeared off into the distance, onto the ground somewhere, and I never saw it again. So they are really skittish things.
That is quite a good technique for slowing moths and other species, say bees, if you can get them in a pot, is to put them in the fridge, cool them down so they go sluggish, and then yeah, you're more likely to be able to get a photo of them. But of course that relies on you catching them in the first place. As Jane says with the moth, maybe clearwing, that she thought she saw the other day, yeah, she tried to get a photo and I guess yeah, it managed to escape being captured by.
Remember, any photograph of a bird is better than no photograph at all. So my advice is, if you're trying to photograph a moth, get in the first one quickly from a distance if you want, so you've got something. Because if it then flies away, you've got something, some idea of what it might have been. If you hadn't got any picture at all, then that's no use whatsoever. And also, don't try to get too close. You want to focus if you can. So I'd much rather have a focused picture, even with just a small moth in the distance, with some context in particular, helps a lot, than one that's right close up, right beside it, but out of focus. That's very unhelpful.
Yeah, that's good advice actually, to get as close as you can and try and get a picture. But before that, as soon as you see it, and this is what I do, so on my camera, maybe you get 7 or 8 pictures of the same thing, and each one you're getting a little bit closer, just so you've got something before it inevitably or usually flies away, and you can always zoom in. And a lot of the recorders, as Norman probably verified, can often get the species determination from what you think is a really poor photo. So you don't always have to have that perfect image to get determination. Absolutely. So yeah, even if you think your photo is pretty rubbish, then still do send it, because it can be really useful. Yeah, and Jane says she started doing just that, trying to get a photo of the moth on the plant. And yeah, she mentions about to give it some size context, and that's also a good thing if you can give an indication of the size of a moth. Maybe if you put it next to a penny or a coin or something like that, or a ruler, or in your comments, if you make a record, say it was this long, 5 centimeters long or whatever, that is really helpful, because size is a good determiner of species. And I think, am I right, Norman, the moth book that you showed with the not the photos, the one with the sketches, they are actually life size as you would usually see the moth landing. That's right.
That's right.
So you could probably get your moth out of the trap and put it on the picture, and it would almost match perfectly. So
one thing I would say as well is, don't Photoshop. Don't try to manipulate the thing to make it look more obvious and bring out the colors, because that makes it worse. I would rather see the picture as it comes, because that's what you see normally. I'm used to seeing the moths in life, and that's what they look like in life. I don't want to see them with the colors photoshopped, and I don't want to see them too close either, because again, it's not what you're looking at by eye. So I'm relying on my memory of what I've seen the moth at that kind of distance, and I don't want too close up.
Okay, that's some good tips on photography. So always try and add a photo to your records. Really useful bit of information. Bhupinder asks about the hummingbird hawk moth, and is there anything that you can do to attract those to your garden? I guess the main thing you might do is grow the plants, the flowers that they're likely to be attracted to for nectar?
Well, buddleia is fine. I mean, buddleia, red valerian, the usual things that people have in their garden. We'll come to that. Honeysuckle crops.
Do the adults have a preference or any long flowers? I guess because do the hummingbirds, hawk moths, they have quite long tongues, if you like. So they go for deeper flowers where they can actually reach the nectar in the bottom. Yeah, that's another nice day-flying moth, the hummingbird hawk moth.
We haven't had a good year for them for some years. I mean, it was one year, some years ago, we had them everywhere and everybody was recording them. But there hasn't been a good hummingbird hawk moth year for some time. Okay, the migrants, of course.
Right, so they'll come in probably with the southerly winds from Europe. Right. Yeah. Here's a question that I was asked actually the other day, and it was: are all moths attracted to light? So obviously the day flying ones particularly probably not, but are the ones that are nocturnal, are all the species attracted to light?
The answer to that is no, they're not. I was reading just recently about a moth called the marsh moth, a very rare one, that is attracted slightly to light, but not very much. And the old lady moth I mentioned doesn't come to light, but does go to sugar. But there are lots of species that won't come to a trap at all. I have no idea why. Some come weekly. Some, I think the red-necked footman comes to light, but it runs. So instead of flying onto your sheet or whatever, it runs along. And whether it actually go into a moth trap, I don't know, but it'll certainly run onto your sheet if you have a lamp and sheet.
Interesting. I guess that.
Different.
Say again, Norman?
They're all different. Yeah.
And I guess moth trapping with light traps is the main way that people record moths, or the nocturnal moths. So I guess that does skew the results that you get, because only the ones that are attracted to light are probably going to be recorded more often.
Yes. Amazingly, though, some day-flying species do come to light in small numbers, nevertheless. And you can occasionally get butterflies in your moth trap. Red admirals sometimes come to light. And also, I've heard for some reason there are one or two clearwings that come to light, even though they're totally day flyers. And I know that we have a record of 6 belted clearwing in a moth trap in Breconshire.
Wow. Maybe it's when the moth traps are turning on when it's still a little bit light. Sort of.
Could be.
So maybe they're still flying. Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
I know. I went to a conifer forest in the southwest of the county some years ago, looking for some specialist conifer feeding moths at a light trap. And the only new species for the location that I recorded was a day-flying species that feeds on privet. It had obviously been sitting on a leaf and just dropped into the trap from above.
Oh, right.
You never know.
Yeah, you don't only get moths in your moth trap. You often find caddisflies, cockchafers, the maybug.
Cockchafers. In May, cockchafers are a nuisance in moth traps. Yeah. Okay. Some people have trouble with wasps eating their moths. Hornets sometimes come in. I've had one year where we had hornets. They're lovely things, I think, but there we are. Bats can get in and birds can get in. So I've had stories of people with a very fat wren that couldn't even fly because he'd eaten so many moths.
Yeah, just lots of wings left in your moth trap.
Yeah.
And beetles as well. You often get beetles in there, especially the sulphur day ones, the carrion beetles that eat dead things. Yeah, so yeah, it's not only moths. It can be quite exciting opening your trap in the morning. Christine asks about moonlight, and does this deter moths from coming to a light trap?
And the answer is yes, it does. The best moth nights are cloudy, muggy, warm, windless, and that's what happened last week on Friday night, when it was all of those things. It rained, but moths fly in the rain; they don't mind that. So a night of that kind without the moon is best. The moon, for some, seems to be a counter attraction to the ultraviolet light. It's partly that, and partly the clear skies make it colder as well. But the moon's a bad thing. full moon is not good.
Yeah, check your calendars for new moon evenings, and then fingers crossed for the other weather that you can't really determine when it might happen.
And of course, you're also trying for different moths at different times of the year. So if your target species flies in the 3rd week of June, for example, and it's full moon, then you've got to put up with the full moon.
Makes it harder, yeah.
Yeah.
Bhupinder asks about invasive species such as the box tree moth, which is of course devastating a lot of box hedges. Are they causing any problems for native moth species? So is there any detrimental effect of moths on each other, on their own?
Well, now then, in alien moths is a very complex issue. One thinks about the one that's devastating the horse chestnut moth, the horse chestnut tree. So it's an alien moth. It's come in recently for the last 20 years or so, and is hammering away at the horse chestnut trees. But the horse chestnut is an alien as well. It hasn't been here all that long. So what you've got is an alien tree being a habitat for an alien moth, and a very attractive alien moth as well. It's biodiversity. I don't worry too much. The box tree moth is very welcome in my garden. I've got a box tree hedge, and I'd love to see the moth in my garden. Maybe not too many, admittedly, but I just like to see moths. The one that I like least in my locality is the one that's eating my carpets.
In the house.
The case-bearing clothes moth, Tania pellinella, and I've got those in large numbers still, and I can't get rid of it. So that's a bit of a problem. But otherwise, there aren't many moths that I would think were problems. I can't think of. It's an interesting question. I can't think of any moths, any species of moth that is known to be causing any damage to other species that we might be losing. I don't think that's an issue particularly.
I suppose the only way that might happen is if an alien moth is detrimental to the food plant of another moth species, if that moth is quite specific in what it would lay its eggs on for the caterpillars to eat.
That's true. I can't think of one. I can't think of one where that is the case. The only animal that's causing that problem is man, of course.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Is there any more questions? Either unmute yourself and maybe ask in person, or if you want to pop anything in the chat, I can ask you. Ask Norman on your behalf. I think
or send in, I mean, afterwards, send in your comments or your questions to Ben, to me, and we'll answer them.
Yeah, if you do think of anything, or you want to share any images, moths that you trap in your garden, or that you managed to find on Budlear later on in the year, do send them to myself. I've just posted my email address there, ben@bis.org.uk. Or if you go onto the BIS website, so www.bis.org.uk, you find lots of information, and in our getting involved, find an expert section, you will be able to find an email link to Norman, so you can contact him directly. Originally by a form, and then Norman will make contact with you so you can share photos. And I know Norman is very glad to receive pictures of moths, and
absolutely
very able to identify them mostly. So do keep in touch with him, get in touch with him.
Sometimes I can't. I mean, you can't always identify everything. Sometimes there are images that I say, well, sorry, I don't know what that is. Of the 18 that I got from my correspondent a couple of days ago, I managed 17, but the 18th defeated me.
Mm-hmm. That's pretty good.
That's pretty good. Yeah.
And Jane also asks about moths. Well, she says that there are moths that can upset bee colonies. Now I know there's the wax moth, isn't there?
That's the one I'm thinking of. Yeah, I couldn't remember the name. The wax moth. Yeah.
The wax moth and the lesser wax moth.
Yeah.
And I think the lesser probably is a bigger problem than the wax moth, as I understand it.
Oh, okay. And there's processionary moths, which I don't think they're native here, but I've seen pictures of them being very destructive. The caterpillars, processionary caterpillars. But I have a lot of, sorry, I have a lot of trouble identifying moths, and they are so small. At the moment, where I live, it's very remote. We've got a lot of bracken. It's common land and a bit of wetland, as in it's marshy. And there's lots of little silver moths around, but I'm absolutely finding it impossible to photograph them.
There'll be small ermine moths.
Small ermine moths.
Yes.
Is that what they be? Because they're so small, I can't see them. You see the pattern, the patterns.
Oh, they're silver with black spots.
And well, they may be. That's it. I can't see them. I suppose a magnifying glass would be helpful sometimes, wouldn't it? When I'm studying them, I wear my reading glasses, obviously, but I haven't used a moth trap yet, so I'm basically chasing after them in the bracken through the fields and streams.
Oh, they're probably
yeah,
grass moths, grass veneers of some kind.
Okay, yeah, and there's. But I have seen, I haven't seen them this year yet, but I've seen yellow underwings and red underwings because they're quite large. The macro moths, the large moths, seem to be much lower in numbers. When I was a kid, and because we're off grid, we had masses of big moths around the candles in the house, but now I don't really see many big moths at all.
The numbers have gone down a lot. They certainly have, and that's quite, again, this comes back to man and the practices of man's followed over the last 50, 100 years in particular. Things like insecticides and
phosphates.
Yes, nutrients.
Yeah.
Ravaging hedges, all of these things. Lots of flowered meadows, lots of woodland. For all these reasons, the moth numbers have gone down a lot.
The meadows have been utterly destroyed. When I was a child, they were full of orchids, and I used to go around noting all the flowers, and now it's just grown for silage really, and pasture, and the sheep eat everything. So unless it's I've forgotten the names of the plants now, but all the very low growing plants, birdsfoot trefoil and stuff, there's plenty of that around, but it's only low growing. The stitchwort, as soon as it comes up, it gets eaten. So yeah, there is a massive loss of biodiversity in my very remote part of Wales. Yeah, it's certainly becoming a bit of a green desert, as Yolo Williams put it. But this is why I want to record moths, because I've seen this the macro moths disappearing. I find it very hard to identify the micro moths, but I've been trying to get photos. And micro moths, are they a certain size? Why are they called, some called micro moths and others?
The same reason as why they're called butterflies and why they're called moths. There's no real scientific reason for it. It's just certain families of Lepidoptera have been grouped in the 19th century into butterflies and moths, and then have been grouped from moths, macro moths, which people have written books about, and micro moths, which they haven't. But I mean, some people have written books entirely about the micro moths. I mean, this one is entirely about micro moths.
Yeah, I know. I've got the Collins book, which is photographic, and I found for British butterflies and moths. And the names of the moths are absolutely incredible, aren't they?
Yeah.
I don't know how many people have looked at the names of moths, but yes, the names, they're just so diverse in themselves. You know, from a red underwing to a northern pug to a bulrush wainscot, where they're absolutely remarkable. Sheer poetry, some of them. Yeah.
Okay, are we coming to an end?
Thank you. Yeah.
Coming to an end.
Yes,
Yeah,
but thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jane. Yeah, and yeah, do send pictures to me or Norman if you can, and we can definitely try and help you with the identification. Yeah, we've gone over 9 o'clock. I know some of us are keen to watch the TV for some reason, maybe a football match is on or something. So yeah, thanks all for joining us. Thanks to you, Norman, for sharing your knowledge on
You're very
moths.
welcome.
And yeah, do contact Norman. He's very happy to receive emails.